in which a clergyman is wrong about tea, a lady's cup is too right. And Lord Peter quotes Aristotle to a cow. It is a general failing, said Lord Peter Wimsey, to no one in particular, and certainly not to the cow who had wandered into the lane, that Englishmen, particularly rural ones, place a touching but misplaced confidence in teapots. The observation followed his narrow escape from an overboiled brew offered in the parsonage drawing-room of Lower Winterley, where the Reverend Hoskin Malling had not only mistaken tannin for hospitality, but also committed the greater sin of serving it with lemon in a china cup already streaked with milk, a chemical abomination, Wimsey murmured, handing the half-full cup back to his man Bunter, who received it with the stoicism of one long acquainted with his master's gastric caution. It was not until 3:30 that afternoon, while seated under a glowering oak beside the rectory's rose pergola, having exhausted both the Mallings' limited conversational charms and the rector's rather too complicated anecdote about Bellpool restoration, that the matter of Mrs. Caldershaw's death came up. "She died," said Reverend Malling, as if announcing the end of the gardening season, "in her parlor just after 11's. The maid found her. Such a gentle woman, widowed, of course. Hadn't been quite right since the war, poor dear. Still, 78 is a decent innings." Lord Peter raised a finger. "Forgive me," he said. "When you say she died just after 11's, are we to understand this is medically attested, or simply ecclesiastically inferred? Her niece, Miss Trotley, was staying. She swears it must have been no later than 11:20. She brought in the tea herself. Found her aunt sitting quite still, her hand still on the saucer. Dead of what? Heart likely, or a stroke. Local Dr. Mansell, bit of a nervous fellow, he's called it natural causes. But," the Reverend leaned in, "Miss Trotley insisted on telegramming the constable, and from there, well, the chief inspector was summoned. Bit of a fuss, really." "Unnatural causes?" Wimsey's tone was airy, though he had ceased twiddling his walking stick. "Well, there's the matter of the tea," said Reverend Malling, uneasily. "Her teacup was full." There was a short silence, interrupted only by the distant caw of a rook and the cow, chewing philosophically some yards off. "Ah," said Lord Peter at last. "And she was, presumably, one of those thoroughbred Englishwomen for whom 11's was more sacrament than snack?" "Precisely. She took it every morning at 11 sharp, 1 biscuit, 1 spoonful of marmalade. The maid was quite insistent." Wimsey stood, brushed an invisible speck from his cuff, and glanced at the cloudy sky. "Then it is very simple," he said. "We must pay our respects to the late Mrs. Caldershaw. Bunter, be so good as to inquire whether the mortuary has been given a respectable address." Bunter, having already extracted the name from the reluctant vicar's housekeeper, nodded silently. "And Reverend," said Wimsey, turning back, "I do rather think your bell-pulls are out of alignment. Might explain the ringing ghost if such a one exists." "The ghost?" Malling blinked. Wimsey offered him a half-smile, faint and non-committal. "Oh, just a whisper. One of the villagers said something rather Gothic, bells ringing on still nights and such, but don't concern yourself. It's probably only the wind or guilt." With that, Lord Peter turned on his heel, nodded at the cow as though she were Cicero, and walked off into the lane, quoting aloud, "For even in death, the semblance of ritual must be preserved, though the gods may have long departed." And behind him, the first uneasy suspicion of something amiss settled over Lower Winterley like an unexpected frost. The road from the rectory to the late Mrs. Caldershaw's residence, Willowshade House, lay just beyond the churchyard, flanked by lichen-clad walls and reluctant daffodils clinging to life despite an unusually damp April. Lord Peter strode along the mossy path with the brisk, loose-limbed stride of a man for whom curiosity was as invigorating as exercise. Bunter followed at a decorous distance, his umbrella at the ready against the muttering sky. Willowshade was a respectable country residence stone, ivy-swathed, with narrow leaded windows and a slightly arthritic garden that had once been source of parish envy. A small brass plaque on the wrought iron gate still bore the Caldershaw name, though someone had affixed a strip of black ribbon to it, an ambiguous gesture, as if grief were being observed out of habit rather than conviction. Door was opened by a maid of perhaps 20, red-eyed, hollow-cheeked, and trying desperately to reconcile grief with propriety. "Miss Trottley is in the drawing-room," she murmured, eyes darting nervously at Whimsy's monocle. "She said you might come." "The inspector's already gone, said there was nothing more to be done until the post-mortem." Whimsy inclined his head. "And you are?" "Annie, sir. I've been with Mrs. Caldershaw 4 years now. Since after Mr. Caldershaw died." He gave her a brief smile, equal parts gentleness and professional calculation. "Ah, loyalty, an admirable trait, though often misplaced in fiction and employment. Might I impose upon you for a moment before seeing Miss Trottley?" She nodded, almost grateful to be given something definite to do. "Tell me, Annie, how did Mrs. Caldershaw take her tea?" "Always the same, sir. Weak, milkin' first, sugar half a spoon. Lapsang souchong if it was in the cupboard, but more often Darjeeling. She said it had backbone, like Queen Mary." "And the cup?" Annie hesitated. "The rose-patterned bone. China. It's chipped on the handle, but she wouldn't use any other. Said it kept the warmth." "Very well. And yesterday morning?" "I brought the tray in at 5 minutes past 11. Miss Trottley had gone to fetch the paper, so I set it down as usual. Mrs. Caldershaw was sitting in the armchair by the window, just as she always did. I asked if she wanted the fire stoked, and she said she was warm enough, thank you. I left, and came back about 20 minutes later. Miss Trottley had already found her. Did you notice anything strange?" She blinked. "Only that the tea hadn't been touched. The cup was full." Whimsy nodded, a fraction slower this time, as though each corroboration laid down a weight instead of removing one. "Tell me, was the cup on the saucer or off it?" Annie stared. "On, sir, always on." "Ah, as proper as you like." He dismissed her gently, then stepped into the drawing-room where Miss Imogen Trottley stood examining a faded oil of a fox hunt with the sort of steely determination that only grief or inherited snobbery can foster. She was a tall woman of perhaps 30, with an anxious mouth and uncompromisingly neat auburn hair that suggested schoolmistress blood, or at the very least a severe commitment to partings and pins. "Miss Trottley?" Whimsy extended a hand. "Lord Peter Whimsy. I gather you were the one who took the initiative in involving the constabulary." Her handshake was cool and brief. Dr. Mansell was too quick to declare it natural. "But I knew Aunt Edith. She never left tea, not even when she was ill. Not even after Uncle Charles died with his soup spoon halfway to his mouth. If she didn't drink it, something was wrong." Whimsy took a seat in the rosewood chair opposite. It had the weary creak of an old friend that had witnessed too many whispered confessions and carefully rationed shortbreads. "Walk me through it, if you please. From your first glimpse of her that morning." "I'd been down to fetch the morning paper. She refused to have it brought to her bedroom like some old invalid. I made the tea myself that day. Annie was dusting in the dining room. Aunt was sitting in her usual chair by the window. The curtains were open. The weather was dismal." "As indeed it remains," murmured Whimsy, glancing at the long window with its drizzle-veiled view of the croquet lawn. "I said something innocuous, clouds are lowering, or some such. She replied just as usual, it's the barometer's fault. She always blamed the barometer when she was low." I placed the tray on the table beside her and unfolded the paper. That was at 11:20, give or take. I asked her something about the vicar's sermon, I think, and when she didn't answer, I looked up. Her eyes were open, but fixed. Her hand was resting on the saucer, not clutching it. I touched her shoulder. She was cold. I screamed. Annie came in. "We sent for Dr. Mansell." She inhaled stiffly, the recounting having cost her more than she'd expected. Whimsy leaned forward gently. "And the teacup?" She gestured toward the sideboard. "Bunter has it, I believe. The police left it behind. Said there was nothing. To test no obvious residue." Bunter stepped forward and produced the cup and saucer from a linen-wrapped box. Whimsy peered at it through his monocle, turning it delicately in his long fingers. There is, as Annie described, a slight chip on the handle, but more interesting, there is no milk film. "Excuse me?" Miss Trottley's voice sharpened. If the milk had been added first, and the tea poured, and left for 20 minutes untouched, there should be a skim-a-scum if one wishes to be vulgar across the top. But the surface is quite clear. "Are you suggesting the tea wasn't poured?" "I'm suggesting," said Whimsy, rising to stand near the fireplace, "that someone poured the tea after Mrs. Caldershaw died, or pretended to." Miss Trottley stared. "Why on earth would anyone do that?" "Ah," said Whimsy softly, "now that is the question. Not who or how, but why the charade with the teacup?" He wandered toward the hearth and touched the porcelain mantel clock. "Stopped at 11:17. Curious. Was it working yesterday?" "No, it hasn't kept time in years. The spring's gone. Aunt never replaced it, said it reminded her of something. I never asked what." "Poignant," said Whimsy, "and perhaps useful." He turned. "Now, forgive me another eccentric question. This bell," he indicated a pull cord hanging discreetly beside the fire, "when rung, where does it go?" "To the kitchen," said Miss Trottley. "There's a small indicator box with the rooms marked. Annie watches it when she's about. Does it still function? I've no idea. We've used it so seldom since the war." "Bunter," said Whimsy, "would you oblige?" Bunter, with silent efficiency, pulled the cord. In the hallway, a faint chime could be heard, followed shortly by Annie, breathless. "Someone rang?" she asked, confused. "Capital," murmured Whimsy. "No ghost, then just a well-oiled bell. Thank you, Annie." When she had gone, Miss Trottley frowned. "Lord Peter, what exactly do you think happened to my aunt?" "I'm not sure yet," he replied, slipping the cup and saucer into the protective wrap Bunter had prepared. "But I think someone took great care to make her. Death appear banal. And when a person goes to such lengths to craft a scene of domestic innocence, one must ask what was so intolerable about the truth." He moved to the window and looked out at the garden, where the lawn dipped slightly toward a hedge. "I think I should like to see the rest of the house," he said softly, "if it's not too much trouble. The upstairs rooms in particular." Miss Trottley paled a little. "Of course, though. There's nothing up there of interest. Only Aunt's bedroom, mine, and a small study. She rarely used it after Uncle's passing." "All the more reason to look," said Whimsy, his voice still gentle but insistent. "After all, it's usually the quietest corners that hide the loudest truths." The narrow staircase creaked beneath Lord Peter's polished boots as he ascended. Bunter close behind with the lightest possible footfall. The house had settled in its age like a weary old gentleman, faintly groaning under the weight of memories, best left unspoken. Miss Trottley led the way, her hands folded tightly in front of her, a fragile fortress against whatever unease lurked upstairs. The first door on the left was Mrs. Caldershaw's bedroom, an austere chamber of pale walls and modest furnishings, all meticulously arranged and untouched since the day the old lady died. A thin shaft of afternoon light cut across the unmade bed, casting shadows that seemed to deepen the stillness rather than soften it. The faint scent of lavender lingered, mingled with something more clinical, a faint trace of disinfectant or perhaps the tincture of grief. Lord Peter moved slowly, methodically, eyes flicking over the lace curtains, the wardrobe door slightly ajar, the books neatly stacked on the bedside table. Nothing appeared disturbed, no sign of struggle. Yet the room felt charged with a silent narrative, as though every object bore witness to a withheld secret. He knelt by the chair where the tea tray had been set that fatal morning. The delicate rose-patterned cup was absent here. Bunter had it safely in his possession. Instead, an empty saucer sat with a silver teaspoon neatly laid across it. Whimsy's gaze lingered on the teaspoon's handle. A tiny dent marred the polished surface. A trivial detail, perhaps, but in his experience, it was precisely such trivialities that saved one from the folly of premature conclusions. "May I?" he said, touching the edge of the chair. Miss Trottley nodded silently. "Was it customary for your aunt to sit here every morning?" "Yes, she liked the light from the east window, said it reminded her of days spent abroad before the war." "And this teaspoon, does it often find itself damaged?" "Not to my knowledge," she replied with a guarded glance. "Though the servants sometimes bicker over the silver. It's an old set, delicate. Mrs. Caldershaw was quite particular." Lord Peter stood, moving toward the study at the end of the corridor. The door was locked. "I assume the key is nearby?" "Yes, here," she said, fishing it from a small ring of keys she carried on a chain around her neck. "Though the study has not been used in months." Aunt said it reminded her too much of the past. Whimsy unlocked the door with a deft twist, stepping inside with Bunter following discreetly. The room was cramped, lined with shelves sagging under the weight of dusty volumes and loose papers. A heavy desk dominated the center, its surface cluttered with letters, a half-filled inkwell, and a small pile of unopened correspondence. He moved to the desk and examined the letters. Most were addressed to Mrs. Caldershaw, some from old friends, others from distant relatives. One envelope, sealed with dark red wax, caught his eye. The crest was unfamiliar, a snarling lion rampant beneath a crown. "Do you know this seal?" Whimsy asked. Miss Trottley shook her head. "No. Aunt had no contact with anyone bearing that emblem, as far as I know." Carefully, Whimsy broke the seal and unfolded the letter. It was brief, typed with a neat precision that bespoke a professional hand. "Dear Mrs. Caldershaw, we regret to inform you that your presence is requested at the family estate concerning certain unsettled matters of inheritance. It is imperative that you attend in person by the 15th of this month. Please treat this as a matter of utmost urgency." There was no signature, only the letterhead. Ashcombe & Co., Solicitors, London. Wimcy frowned. An inheritance summons. Quite a serious matter for a lady in the countryside. Miss Trottley's eyes narrowed. She never mentioned it. Perhaps she hoped to avoid the company of such reminders, Whimsy suggested. "May I see the rest of your aunt's correspondence?" She hesitated, then handed over a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Most were mundane invites to church socials, garden club meetings, but scattered among them were several more from Ashcombe & Co., each more insistent than the last. The latest was dated only 3 days prior to her death. An unsettled estate, Whimsy murmured, and no mention to the family. Odd. "Perhaps she feared scandal," Miss Trottley said quietly. "There have been rumors about Uncle Charles's business dealings, debts, misappropriations. Aunt was always fiercely protective of his reputation." "Debts, you say? And who knew of these rumors?" "A small circle. The solicitor, of course. A few distant cousins. But Aunt Edith kept her cards close." Whimsy tucked the letters away, his mind already weaving a tapestry of possibilities. "I should like to examine the rest of the house. The servants' quarters, if you would not mind." Downstairs, the house took on a different character, less polished, more lived in. Annie led the way through narrow corridors and low-ceilinged rooms, scented faintly of boiled cabbage and lavender water. The kitchen was warm and bustling. The cook, a stout woman with an apron dusted in flour, paused her work to offer a curt nod. "Did Mrs. Caldershaw have any enemies hereabouts?" Whimsy asked, casually. The cook sniffed. "Enemies, sir? Not many, but old Mrs. Caldershaw was a hard woman. She kept her staff on a tight leash. No nonsense, no complaints. I've seen some servants leave in tears, if that counts. Was there any discord recently? Miss Annie and the gardener had a row over the hedges. Nothing serious, mind you. But Miss Annie can be fierce. Anything else? Any strangers about? Last week, a man came asking questions about the estate. Tall, sharp-eyed. Looked like a solicitor or some such. Didn't say much. Whimsy made a note. And the gardener? John. He's a quiet fellow, but loyal enough. Lives just over the hill. Outside, the garden was a tangled patchwork of spring blooms and stubborn weeds. Whimsy paused to examine a stone sundial at the center, its gnomon casting a faint shadow that seemed slightly off-kilter. Curious, he muttered. The sundial is misaligned by a few degrees. Bunter raised an eyebrow. Does that have any bearing on the tea, milord? Not yet, Bunter. But when dealing with time and death, one never dismisses misalignment. The day waned, shadows lengthened, and the village began to settle into its habitual quietude. Back in the drawing room, Miss Trottley awaited with a brittle composure that suggested more storm beneath the surface than she cared to show. Whimsy poured himself a fresh cup of tea from the pot, no lemon, no milk, just the faint bitterness of leaves steeped properly. Miss Trottley, he began, I gather your aunt kept a strict routine. But routine can be both a shield and a trap. She looked up sharply. Who else knew of the solicitor's letters? No one, to my knowledge, not Annie, certainly. I was only made aware yesterday. And the day of her death? Did she receive any visitors? Miss Trottley shook her head. Only Annie and myself when I returned with the paper. Did she seem worried, distracted? I thought she was unwell, but she insisted it was nothing. Said she was tired of secrets and ready for peace. Whimsy folded his hands. A cryptic farewell, perhaps, or a warning. He leaned forward. One last question. Did your aunt drink her tea immediately after it was poured? Always. And on that morning? Miss Trottley hesitated. Annie said it remained untouched. The cup full. Whimsy's eyes twinkled with a mixture of irony and gravity. Precisely. Which brings us back to the question you began with. The widow's teacup was full, but the woman was dead. What happened in the minutes between pouring and the final silence? Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the faintest hint of something ancient and sorrowful, an echo of a past that would not stay buried. But Lord Peter Whimsy, as always, was already several steps ahead. In the dance of shadows and truths, the evening deepened into a chill so subtle it seemed to seep into the very walls of Folly Manor, as if the house itself were exhaling the long-held breath of its many secrets. Lord Peter sat near the hearth, fingers steepled beneath his chin, while Miss Trottley hovered nervously nearby, as though awaiting judgment or reprieve. Bunter, ever the silent sentinel, returned from his quiet perusal of the servants' quarters, with a report delivered in his habitual subdued tone. "My lord, I have noted that the kitchen clock ceased striking at precisely 10:30 on the morning in question. It appears the mechanism had been deliberately halted." "A stopped clock, you say?" "Curious," Whimsy murmured, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "The kitchen clock would serve as the temporal heartbeat for much of the household. A deliberate halt would suggest interference with the very measurement of time." Miss Trottley paled. "Who would tamper with the clock? To what end?" "Patience," Whimsy said. "We are merely assembling pieces of a puzzle whose picture is as yet obscure." The mention of interrupted time led Whimsy to revisit the sundial he had observed earlier. The misaligned gnomon was not merely a trivial quirk of a neglected garden ornament, but a deliberate calibration error, perhaps set to deceive the unwary eye on the matter of solar time. He made a mental note to inquire about the exact timing of events on the day of Mrs. Caldershaw's death, suspecting that the household's accepted chronology might have been manipulated. The question that gripped him now was simple yet profound. If the widow's teacup remained full, who was present in those silent minutes? who stood watch as time itself seemed to falter. A summons to the drawing room interrupted his reverie. The local constable had arrived, his expression a mixture of official duty and polite reluctance. His presence was a reminder that the matter had already begun to draw the scrutiny of law and the eagerness perhaps to close the case swiftly. "Lord Peter," said the constable, "I trust you have found everything in order?" "As much as a house full of secrets allows, constable." "Might I inquire about the medical examination?" "The coroner's verdict is poison, naturally. No signs of forced entry or struggle. The cup, as you noted, was untouched. And yet, the fatal dose was administered." Whimsy raised a delicate brow. "And the poison itself? Was it identified?" "Arsenic, from what the chemist reports. A slow-acting, almost theatrical choice. We are dealing with a premeditated act, clearly. Arsenic classic." "And how accessible was it within the household?" The constable shrugged. "Mrs. Caldershaw kept a small cabinet of remedies and tonics in her study. We've taken possession of the contents. Nothing else was missing, save the cup itself, now secured." "That cup remains a silent witness," Whimsy said. "Tell me, constable, have you questioned all the household staff?" "All except the gardener, who is currently at home due to a sprained ankle." "Ah, the gardener," Whimsy mused aloud. "A man who, though seemingly peripheral, often holds the key to such puzzles. He tends the land but sees far more than the house's occupants suppose." With the constable excusing himself to oversee further inquiries, Whimsy seized the opportunity to revisit the study. The inkwell, papers, and letters had already yielded hints, but the drawer beneath the desk remained locked. Miss Trottley produced another key, a smaller one this time, which opened the drawer with a quiet click. Inside lay a collection of diaries, their leather bindings worn and pages yellowed. Whimsy selected the most recent volume, leafing through entries penned in a neat, deliberate hand. The entries painted a portrait of a woman increasingly burdened by unseen pressures, references to the looming shadow, the weight of secrets, and the inevitable reckoning. There was mention of a Mr. Langley, whose visits had become more frequent and whose presence seemed to bring both comfort and anxiety. "Who is Mr. Langley?" Whimsy asked when Miss Trottley rejoined him. Her eyes flickered with hesitation. "He was an old friend of my aunt's, a solicitor from London. Came to discuss the estate and matters left unresolved." "Did your aunt confide in you about him?" "No, never. But she grew more withdrawn in recent weeks." Whimsy's mind spun the threads together. The solicitor's letters, the mysterious visitor, the halted clock, the misaligned sundial all suggested a house caught in a web of time and deception. The next morning, Whimsy took the opportunity to visit the gardener, John Evans. The man's cottage lay a mile beyond the village, nestled among hedgerows and fields freshly green with spring. John was a rugged figure, with hands calloused from years of toil and eyes bright with unspoken knowledge. Whimsy approached with his characteristic blend of charm and curiosity. "Mr. Evans, I trust your ankle is mending?" "Aye, milord, thank you. Won't stop me from doing what's needed. I was hoping you might help me understand something peculiar. The kitchen clock stopped at 10:30 the morning Mrs. Caldershaw died. Did you notice anything unusual that day?" John scratched his chin. "Now that you mention it, I was down in the tool shed round that time. Heard voices from the house quiet, but tense. Miss Trottley's voice mostly, I reckon. Then the sound of footsteps, not hers. Could you identify the other?" "No. But I did hear a soft clink, like metal on china. Could have been the teaspoon, if you ask me. Interesting. Did you see anyone enter or leave the grounds?" "Only the postman and young Annie, the housemaid. She was carrying something wrapped in cloth, looked heavy." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mr. Evans. Your observations may prove quite valuable." Returning to the manor, Whimsy summoned Annie for a discreet interview. The girl was pale, with eyes wide from too many sleepless nights. "Annie," You were seen carrying something on the morning of Mrs. Caldershaw's death. What was it? Annie bit her lip. It was the silver salver, sir. I took it to the kitchen to fetch the tea. A salver? Whimsy pressed. Was it missing from the usual place? Yes. It had been on the sideboard in the drawing room, but that morning it was gone. Did you notice anything unusual about the salver? No, sir. It was just the same as always. Thank you, Annie. That will be all. As the day progressed, Whimsy's thoughts returned to the missing salver and the stopped clock. There was a pattern emerging, subtle but undeniable. Items displaced, time manipulated, moments stretched or shortened to fit a narrative not quite truthful. Late in the afternoon, Miss Trottley approached with a tentative question. Lord Peter, might I ask, do you believe this was murder? Whimsy considered the question carefully, as one might weigh a delicate wine. I believe, Miss Trottley, that Mrs. Caldershaw's death was neither accident nor natural, but a deliberate act masked by the trappings of routine and propriety. The question remains, who benefits from this silence, and what truths lie hidden beneath the widow's full teacup? Her breath caught. But who would harm her? She was a kind woman, though strict. Kindness is no shield against human frailty or greed, Whimsy replied, lighting a cigarette with an elegant flick. In these country houses, as in all human affairs, appearances are a clever disguise for far more tangled motives. That evening, as the household retired under the watchful gaze of the portraits lining the paneled walls, Whimsy remained by the fire, piecing together the fragments of a carefully constructed facade. The sundial, the clock, the silver salver all told of a choreographed deception designed to mislead and obfuscate. And somewhere in the silence of Folly Manor, the truth waited, like a shadow in the gathering dusk, ready to be drawn into the light. The morning air held a faint chill as Lord Peter Whimsy descended the broad staircase of Folly Manor, his mind already racing through the facts collected thus far. The household was still roused but subdued. Servants and family alike bore the pallor of unease, their polite smiles less assured beneath the weight of recent tragedy. Yet beneath the surface, a current of tension simmered, one that promised to pull secrets to the fore with relentless insistence. Whimsy's first port of call was the drawing room once again. Miss Trottley awaited him there, eyes bright but tinged with worry. Lord Peter, I thought you might want to see this. She handed over a neatly folded letter, its envelope bearing the seal of a London solicitor. Breaking the seal, Whimsy scanned the letter quickly. It was from Mr. Langley, the solicitor mentioned in the widow's diaries. The letter was curt and formal, acknowledging receipt of certain papers and requesting an early meeting to discuss matters of some urgency relating to the Caldershaw estate. Notably, the letter had been penned 2 days before the widow's death. Did your aunt mention this letter to you? Whimsy inquired. Miss Trottley shook her head. No, sir. If she had, I should have known. But she seemed increasingly anxious after his visits. Whimsy folded the letter carefully, his mind turning to the curious rhythm of recent days. Mr. Langley's presence, coupled with the widow's evident distress, suggested that the legal affairs surrounding the estate might be more complicated than they appeared. Perhaps even a source of motive. Do you know if any others were aware of this letter or the nature of Mr. Langley's business? Whimsy asked. Only the housekeeper, Mrs. Prendergast. She was most particular about privacy. Mrs. Prendergast, Whimsy mused aloud. A woman of order, one would imagine. Perhaps it would be wise to speak with her next. The housekeeper was found in the servants' hall, supervising breakfast with an air of command. When Whimsy presented himself and explained his interest, she sighed, the lines of age and worry deepening on her face. Yes, Mr. Whimsy, I knew about the letter. The solicitor came several times. My lady was very secretive about what was discussed, but I could see it troubled her. Something about the terms of the will, I believe. Did you notice any change in the household's atmosphere following his visits? Mrs. Prendergast paused, choosing her words carefully. Tension, sir. The kind that hides in silence. Miss Trottley was uneasy, and even the master, well, his visits grew less frequent, and when he did come, he seemed distracted. Was the master, Mr. Caldershaw, in residence at the time? Whimsy pressed. No, sir. He had been away on business in London. Returned late on the evening before the incident. Whimsy's brow furrowed. The timing was significant. If Mr. Caldershaw was absent for much of the day, and returned only after the poisoning, his alibi might warrant closer scrutiny. He excused himself and made his way to the library, where a recent letter from Mr. Caldershaw had been left among the widow's papers. The letter was brisk and somewhat dismissive, referencing pressing matters that delayed his return, and instructing his wife to maintain discretion about certain financial dealings. The tone was curt, devoid of the warmth one might expect. From a husband concerned for his spouse's well-being, Whimsy's thoughts turned once more to the silver salver and the halted kitchen clock. There was a peculiar orchestration here, a choreography of appearances and timing, as if the actors on this small stage had rehearsed their parts with care. Later that afternoon, Whimsy arranged to speak again with the household staff, beginning with Annie, the housemaid. Her earlier nervousness had given way to a certain stoicism, though her eyes remained wide and watchful. Annie, Whimsy began gently, you mentioned carrying the silver salver that morning. Did anything seem amiss? Did you notice who might have handled it before or after you? Annie hesitated. I'm not sure, sir. I brought it to the kitchen, as usual. But when I returned, the tea had not been served. Miss Trottley was in the drawing room, pacing. And the teacup? It was still full, sir. Did you see who poured the tea? Or if it was poured at all? Annie shook her head. No, sir. I went back to my chores. I thought Miss Trottley might be preparing it. The incongruity nagged at Whimsy. A full cup, a missing salver, a silent kitchen clock. He decided to revisit the scene of the crime. The drawing room was quiet, suffused with late afternoon light filtered through heavy curtains. Whimsy examined the teacup more closely. Its rim was pristine. No lipstick stain, no sign of disturbance. The saucer bore the faintest mark of a teaspoon's placement, but no indentation suggested recent use. His attention shifted to the windows. One was slightly ajar, allowing a faint breeze to stir the curtains. The lock appeared secure, but the gap raised questions about ingress or egress. Then, a faint creaking sound from the corridor beyond caught his attention. He stepped outside and found Bunter quietly dusting the portraits. The butler nodded respectfully. Bunter, do you recall if the windows in this wing are usually left ajar? Bunter straightened. Not usually, my lord. They are kept closed for the sake of the carpets and to preserve the furniture. Yet this one is open? Yes, my lord. Do you remember seeing anyone near it? No, my lord. Thank you. And the carpets? Any signs of disturbance? Bunter's eyes scanned the floor. None, my lord. They are in perfect condition. This last fact was troubling. If an intruder had entered or exited via the window, one might expect some disturbance. Whimsy's gaze then landed on the heavy carpet beneath the window. A faint impression, barely visible, suggested something or someone had pressed there. The marks were subtle but consistent with the weight of a human foot. Bunter, might I trouble you to fetch a magnifying glass? Within moments, Bunter returned with the requested instrument. Whimsy scrutinized the carpet with increasing interest. The indentation showed the heel and sole of a shoe, oriented toward the window. It was a recent impression, though the fibers around it remained undisturbed, suggesting the individual had stepped carefully. Curious, Whimsy mused. A carefully executed entry or exit through this window would require a degree of acrobatic skill, and yet the rest of the room remains untouched. His thoughts returned to the halted kitchen clock and the silent tea. It was as if the timeline had been paused deliberately to mask the true sequence of events. That evening, As a storm gathered beyond the manor's thick stone walls, Whimsy requested an audience with Miss Trottley. They sat by the fire, its flames flickering shadows that danced on the ornate ceiling. "Miss Trottley," he began, "I must ask you to recount once more the events of that morning, in as much detail as you can recall." She complied, her voice steady despite the chill in the room. "I arrived early as usual to prepare the house. My aunt was in good spirits at breakfast, though somewhat distracted. Afterward, she retired to her study, where Mr. Langley came to visit. I heard them speak, but not the details. Later, I fetched the tea at around 10:30, carrying the silver salver as usual. The cup was set, but my aunt seemed distant, almost preoccupied. I left to attend to other duties, leaving the tea untouched. Did anyone else come or go during this time?" "No, sir. Except for the gardener, as you know, and the postman who left a package." "Did your aunt express any concerns to you?" "She mentioned troubles ahead, but would say no more." "And the tea? You did not see your aunt drink from the cup?" "No, my lord. It remained untouched." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Miss Trottley. Your account is invaluable." Later. That night, as the manor settled into uneasy silence, Whimsy retired to his study. He reviewed the fragments of evidence, the misaligned sundial, the halted clock, the untouched teacup, the missing silver salver, and the window ajar yet undisturbed save for a faint footprint. He realized that these seemingly trivial details were the threads of a masterful deception. The killer had relied upon an illusion of time and presence, creating a scene designed to mislead both the household and the law. Most intriguing of all was the shadow of Mr. Caldershaw's return late the previous evening, a return that disrupted the carefully maintained chronology. Whimsy's mind raced through possibilities. Had the widow's last hours been marked by more than just anxiety? Had someone exploited the fragile fabric of trust within these walls to exact a final fatal act? The game was far from over, and as the storm outside lashed the manor's windows with increasing fury, Whimsy resolved to delve deeper into the tangled web of relationships and lies. Time, after all, was a most cunning accomplice to crime. As dawn cast a reluctant gray light over Folly Manor, Lord Peter Whimsy rose with the restlessness of a man on the cusp of discovery. The storm from the previous night had swept away with it any residual warmth, leaving the ancient stone walls damp and somber, a fitting metaphor, perhaps, for the mystery that clung to the household like an impenetrable fog. Whimsy's first task was to revisit the chronology, that most delicate and vital of puzzles. His mind sifted carefully through the details gleaned from the interviews and his own observations, reconstructing the widow's last day with meticulous care. The servant's testimony, the halted kitchen clock, the silver salver's curious absence all pointed toward a deliberate orchestration designed to confuse and conceal. But the pivot on which the entire case turned was the arrival of Mr. Caldershaw. Late on the evening before the poisoning. The exact time of his return was critical. According to the butler, Bunter, the master's entrance was just after 9 in the evening, hours after the tea was served, and the widow had presumably retired. Yet, the solicitor's letters hinted at tense legal negotiations and strained family relations motives enough, perhaps, to cloud reason. Whimsy decided that a visit to the local railway station might yield further clarity. It was a small provincial stop with a modest schedule, but even here the smallest discrepancy in travel times could expose an alibi's weakness. The station master was an obliging man, willing to consult the day's records and confirm the arrival of the 8:45 train from London. "Yes, sir, Mr. Caldershaw's name is on the passenger list," the station master confirmed. Train came in right on time, no delays reported. Whimsy noted the precision. The train's punctuality was a thread he intended to pull. Returning to the manor, he requested the household staff gather again. this time with a focus on the exact movements of each individual on the fateful day. His questions were subtle, probing for contradictions cloaked in everyday routine. "Miss Trottley," Whimsy began, "you mentioned the tea was left untouched that morning. Is it possible that someone else might have consumed it later?" Miss Trottley's brows knitted in concern. I don't think so, sir. The cup remained where it was. No one else entered the drawing room until the body was found." "And Mrs. Prendergast, the housekeeper?" "She was occupied in the kitchen most of the morning," Miss Trottley replied. Bunter, standing nearby, added quietly, "I noticed Mrs. Prendergast left the kitchen briefly around 11. Said she was checking on a delivery at the back door." Whimsy's interest sharpened. "A delivery?" "Yes, milord. A package from London, left by the postman." Miss Trottley mentioned it. "The package was found and examined, an innocuous parcel containing books and papers, hardly suspicious in themselves. Yet, the timing of its arrival and the housekeeper's departure raised a question. Was it conceivable that during this brief interval, something transpired unnoticed?" Whimsy's mind returned to the open window in the drawing room. It was out of place, yet the carpet bore only the faintest evidence of a footstep. If an intruder had entered, one would expect disturbance. If it was a member of the household, the window might have been used as a point of concealment or deception. "Bunter," Whimsy said thoughtfully, "have you noticed anything unusual about the curtains or furniture in the drawing room?" "Now you mention it, milord, the curtains by the open window were slightly displaced, as though recently disturbed." "And the armchair near the window?" "There's a faint indentation in the cushion, but that might be from Miss Trottley's habitual seat. Curious. A man could sit there and look out without being seen, perhaps." The pieces began to fit together. Someone had contrived a scenario where the widow might be poisoned without direct confrontation, employing time and space as weapons out later. That day, Whimsy arranged to speak with Mr. Langley, the solicitor whose letters had threaded through the narrative like a dark seam. The man was awaiting him in the drawing room, composed yet visibly anxious. "Mr. Langley," Whimsy began, "your correspondence with the widow suggests a degree of urgency in the matters at hand. Might I trouble you to disclose the nature of these concerns?" Langley's eyes flickered with hesitation. The estate's finances were precarious. The late Mr. Caldershaw's investments had suffered losses, and there were clauses in the will that could alter the inheritance dramatically, such as a codicil recently drafted but unsigned that would have granted the widow sole control, excluding other beneficiaries. And was the widow inclined to sign? Reluctantly. She feared the consequences, especially the reaction of her husband and his family. Whimsy nodded. "Was anyone else privy to these negotiations?" "Only myself and, of course, the housekeeper, who served as a conduit for correspondence." The housekeeper's role, once seemingly minor, now loomed large. Whimsy's thoughts returned to Mrs. Prendergast, her discreet comings and goings. Her protection of privacy. Could she have been more than a mere servant? Might she have wielded influence behind the scenes, even desperation? That evening, he requested a final audience with the household. The family, servants, and Mr. Langley assembled in the drawing room, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. "I have listened to all accounts with care," Whimsy began, his tone measured but firm. "This is a house of secrets, where time itself has been manipulated to deceive. The halted kitchen clock, the untouched teacup, the open window, and the missing salver, they form the skeleton of a carefully constructed narrative." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The question is not who had motive many did, but who had the means and cunning to execute such a deception. The answer lies in the delicate interplay of time, opportunity, and misdirection. A rustle swept through the room. Miss Trottley's gaze met his, resolute yet tinged with fear. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "There is one final piece of evidence I must examine before the truth reveals itself." Until then, I ask your patience." As the household dispersed, whispers flourished like shadows in the fading light. Whimsy retired once more to his study, the weight of the case pressing upon him. Time, he reflected, was no mere measure of hours and minutes. It was a weapon wielded by the clever, a veil behind which guilt might hide, and in the silent heart of Folly Manor. The clock was poised to strike its final judgment. Lord Peter Wimsey's study was a sanctuary of quiet reflection, the dusk filtering through mullioned windows and casting long shadows across the scattered papers and open books. He sat in a deep leather chair, the familiar curl of his pipe a gentle accompaniment to the steady unfolding of his thoughts. The strands of the case motives, timelines, peculiar details were weaving together with a complexity that demanded patience and precision. The arrival of the parcel from London, the brief absence of Mrs. Prendergast, the curious pause in the kitchen clock, all were now elements in a pattern that required no leaps of fancy, only a sober appraisal of human nature and the artifice of time. It was then that Bunter entered quietly, bearing a small lacquered box wrapped in plain brown paper. "My lord, this was found behind the bookcase in the drawing-room," he said, placing it gently on the desk. Whimsy raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. A secret compartment behind a bookcase was a device worthy of a Gothic novel, just the sort of contrivance that the police would overlook in their eagerness for a simple explanation. With deliberate care, Whimsy unwrapped the box and lifted its lid. Inside lay a set of documents, letters, wills, and a curious diary, its leather cover cracked with age. The handwriting was a neat, precise scrawl, but the ink had faded almost to illegibility in places. Whimsy examined the diary first. It belonged to the late Mr. Caldershaw, whose health and temperament had been subjects of much speculation. The entries were sporadic, but one passage stood out: April 14th. "The shadows lengthen as trust withers. The widow grows distant, and the house whispers of betrayal. If the law does not protect me, then cunning must suffice." A shiver of anticipation passed through Whimsy. The phrase, "the house whispers of betrayal," was the language of a man burdened with secrets, fearful and yet determined. The diary suggested a fracture deeper than familial quarrels, a premeditation lurking behind the polite facade. The letters and wills confirmed this. A recent codicil drafted by Mr. Caldershaw, unsigned due to his sudden illness, would have altered the distribution of his estate, favoring one beneficiary over others, a beneficiary unnamed but strongly implied by the language. Whimsy's mind returned to Mrs. Prendergast's movements that morning. Could she have acted on behalf of an unseen party, delivering messages or even administering the poison under the guise of routine? The housekeeper was no mere servant, but a figure of considerable influence within the household. Hierarchy. The ticking of the study clock, regular and insistent, drew Whimsy's attention to the necessity of verifying the timeline once more. He instructed Bunter to accompany him back to the drawing-room to examine the positioning of the clock and the state of the curtains near the open window. They found the clock as described, a Conde, large brass-faced instrument that had indeed stopped shortly after 9 the previous evening. Whimsy inspected the mechanism, noting a slight looseness in the winding key, as if deliberately tampered with to halt its progression. "Time has been weaponized here," Whimsy murmured. "The stopped clock serves as a false witness, an alibi, fabricated in stillness." Turning to the window, he noted the displaced curtains once again, and a faint trace of dust disturbed on the windowsill, suggesting a recent intrusion or exit. It is unlikely, given the careful nature of the murderer, that this window was used merely for effect, he said. There must be a practical reason. Bunter pointed toward the adjacent wall, where a heavy tapestry hung, muffling sound and obscuring sight lines. A cunning choice for secret communications or surreptitious passage, Whimsy mused aloud. One wonders whether the house itself has been complicit in this masquerade. The investigation next led Whimsy to revisit the servants individually, pressing for nuances and inconsistencies that had previously escaped notice. He found, intriguingly, that Miss Trottley's steadfast insistence on the teacup's position was less a recollection and more a repetition of what she had been told by the housekeeper. Mrs. Prendergast's veneer of composure began to crack under the subtle pressure of Whimsy's questions. She admitted to having handed over a small vial to the widow the day before the death, a tincture prescribed by a London physician to aid sleep, but it was a harmless preparation. "Sir, nothing to harm," she insisted, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Whimsy's eyes sharpened. Might it be possible that this tincture was altered, either by accident or design? The housekeeper shook her head vehemently, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, the solicitor Langley was summoned once again. Whimsy confronted him with the documents from the secret box and questioned his role in the concealment of the codicil. Langley maintained an air of dignified innocence, but could not disguise a subtle agitation when pressed on why the will had remained unsigned. "It was the master's wish to withhold it until all parties were present," Langley explained. "A matter of family honor, I assure you." "Or a matter of control," Whimsy replied dryly. "Control of time, property, and truth." Whimsy's investigation turned next to the subtle geography of Folly Manor itself. He mapped out the servants' routes, the sightlines between rooms, and the acoustics, particularly focusing on the so-called soundproof door between the drawing room and the adjacent study. The door's seals were imperfect, and a narrow gap allowed sound to escape, despite the butler's assertions to the contrary. This gap was critical. Whispered conversations could have been overheard, alibis tested or constructed. Piecing together the timeline against this acoustic map, Whimsy deduced that a brief, whispered exchange had occurred shortly before the widow's collapse, an exchange that must have passed unnoticed by the household, but was crucial to the killer's plan. Then, a new revelation came from an unexpected source, the local vicar, Reverend Penn, a man of kindly demeanor but sharp intellect. The Reverend disclosed that the widow had confided in him a secret anxiety about a figure from her past day, man whose shadow loomed darkly over her present. This disclosure opened an entirely new dimension to the case, the possibility of a double life, a hidden liaison, or a psychological burden so severe that it might provoke desperate action. Whimsy requested access to the widow's personal effects, including letters and diaries. Among these, a series of letters from a mysterious correspondent, signed only with a single initial, hinted at a clandestine relationship and a threat of exposure. The complexity of human motives layered thick upon each other. Jealousy, fear, greed, and guilt intertwined in a tapestry as dark and intricate as the manor's faded wallpapers. As night fell once more, Lord Peter Whimsy prepared his next move with the patience of a man who knew that the final truth lay not in bold declarations, but in the quiet unfolding of a carefully laid trap. In the deep stillness of Folly Manor, the stage was set for a revelation that would unravel the web of deception, expose the fragile masks worn by all involved, and illuminate the true face of guilt behind the widow's teacup that was full. The night deepened into an almost tangible presence at Folly Manor, thickening the air with the weight of unspoken truths. Lord Peter Whimsy, settled once more in his study, was poring over the letters and the diary of the widow, his fingers tracing the faded ink with a care bordering on reverence. The correspondence, so delicately balanced between confession and concealment, was a map to the unseen corridors of her life, a labyrinth of secrets that had eluded all but the keenest observer. The candle flickered as a gust swept through the half-open window, casting quivering shadows that danced on the walls like phantoms. Whimsy's thoughts crystallized around the mystery correspondent, an entity defined only by a solitary initial, M. The letter spoke of past indiscretions, veiled threats, and a desperate entreaty for silence. They suggested that the widow was entangled in a web far more intricate than a mere familial dispute over inheritance. He reflected on the vicar's revelation, the widow's fear of a man from her past. Could Nem be this shadowy figure? And if so, was his presence connected to her demise? The notion that the poison might be but the climax of a psychological siege grew stronger. Whimsy's gaze shifted to the clock on the mantelpiece. Its pendulum, swinging steadily, the very antithesis of the stopped kitchen clock, whose frozen hands had so captivated his attention. Time, in this house, was a pliable thing, manipulated by intention and fear. He determined that a direct confrontation was now necessary. The following morning, he requested an audience with all household members once more, insisting on the presence of the solicitor Langley and the housekeeper, Mrs. Prendergast. The gathering was tense, the air thick with anticipation and the residue of unvoiced anxieties. Whimsy began by addressing the widow's letters. These reveal a dimension heretofore unconsidered, the presence of an outside party exerting influence, perhaps coercion. It is imperative we understand who M is, and what power he wielded over the deceased. Langley's face paled slightly, but he remained composed. I confess ignorance of this vum. No such correspondent was ever brought to my attention. Mrs. Prendergast, however, exchanged a fleeting glance with Miss Trottley, and her lips pressed into a thin line. The widow was cautious in whom she trusted, she said softly, but there were whispers among the staff. A gentleman who visited in secret, always at dusk, always swiftly. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. A visitor at dusk unobserved, but not unnoticed. The window, then, may not have been a point of entry for a murderer, but for a confidant. The implication was profound. Perhaps the open window had been left ajar deliberately to admit this mysterious visitor, or to signal their presence. He pressed Mrs. Prendergast gently. And what of the tincture you delivered? Was there any indication it might have been tampered with? She hesitated. No, my lord, but I was not privy to its contents. I merely carried the vial as instructed. Whimsy's thoughts returned to the stopped clock, the deliberate halting of time, the misplaced salver, the disrupted curtains, all signaled a staging of events designed to mislead. But who among them had both the motive and the knowledge to orchestrate such subtlety? To unravel this, Whimsy asked that the household be observed discreetly. He proposed a stackout, disguised as a casual inspection of the manor's antiquities and architecture, affording him an excuse to linger in the drawing-room and adjoining corridors late into the night. That evening, as shadows pooled thickly around the corners of the house, Whimsy positioned himself near the window. The moon was a pale sliver behind racing clouds, and the wind whispered through the eaves with a plaintive sigh. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Then, a soft movement caught his eye, a figure approaching the window from the gardens. It was slender and cautious, dressed in dark attire that melded with the night. The figure paused at the sill, lifted the latch, and slipped inside with practiced ease. Whimsy followed silently, keeping to the shadows. The visitor moved swiftly through the drawing-room and paused at a bookshelf. With deft fingers, the person manipulated the volume of books until a hidden latch clicked softly. The very compartment where the box of documents had been found. A small package was extracted, and a brief exchange of words was overheard, a whispered conversation between the visitor and another, whose voice was none other than Mrs. Prendergast's. The housekeeper emerged from the shadowed passage, tension palpable in her stance. They conferred briefly, the visitor nodding and then retreating as silently as he had come. Whimsy retreated to his study to contemplate what he had witnessed. The clandestine meeting, the secret package, and the alliance between visitor and housekeeper illuminated a conspiracy beneath the surface politeness of Folly Manor. The next morning, Whimsy confronted Mrs. Prendergast with the knowledge of her nocturnal visitor. Under the weight of his calm but unyielding gaze, she admitted that the visitor was indeed one Marcus Edgeworth, A man whose prior connection to the widow was both intimate and fraught with bitter recrimination. Edgeworth had been the widow's confidant and once her lover. Their relationship had ended abruptly amidst scandal and threats of exposure. His reappearance had been marked by demands for money and silence, demands that the widow had resisted, but which now threatened to engulf her. Whimsy pressed. Mrs. Prendergast further. Did Mr. Edgeworth possess knowledge of the household's routine sufficient to manipulate time and space to his advantage? She nodded reluctantly. He was clever, sir. He knew the habits of the family and staff. He planned his visits to avoid detection, and he had means of circumventing the servants' attentions. Langley's denial of any knowledge was now called into question. Whimsy's suspicions deepened. Had the solicitor colluded with Edgeworth, or merely remained willfully ignorant? The threads of greed and betrayal seemed entwined with desperation and fear. The final piece of the puzzle lay in the diaries, cryptic references to cunning and betrayal. The poison had been administered not in passion, but as a calculated move in a game of power and control that WIMS EY arranged for Marcus Edgeworth's apprehension at the local inn where he'd been staying under an alias. Edgeworth's arrest was swift, but his defiant glare spoke of a man who believed himself untouchable. Back at Folly Manor, Whimsy assembled the household once more, ready to unfold the tapestry of deception. The case, as I suspected, is not a simple matter of domestic grievance, Whimsy began. It involves a shadow from the past, whose presence disturbed the fragile equilibrium of this house. He detailed the visits of Edgeworth, the secret communications, and the carefully orchestrated manipulation of time, evidenced by the halted clock in the open window. The poisoned teacup was a ruse placed where it would be found, misleading investigators to believe the widow's demise was sudden and solitary. In truth, her death was a culmination of threats, fear, and calculated cruelty. As he spoke, the room grew taut with tension. Bunter's face was impassive, but Miss Trotley's eyes shone with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The motive was financial extortion, yes, Whimsy concluded, but also the destruction of a woman who refused to be silenced. A tragedy wrought not by passion, but by cold, deliberate design. The final revelations poised the household on the brink of catharsis and condemnation. Whimsy's quiet triumph was tempered by the somber reminder that beneath the veneer of civility, human nature's darker impulses awaited their moment to surface. Outside, the first rays of dawn began to lighten the horizon, dispelling night's shadows. Inside, the widow's teacup lay empty, its mystery resolved, but its echo lingered still, a testament to the subtle and inexorable power of truth. The room remained heavy with silence after Lord Peter Whimsy's summation, each listener weighed down by the gravity of his revelations. Yet, as the last vestiges of the night fled and the first pale light of dawn seeped through the heavy curtains, a subtle tension, one born not merely of guilt or relief but of expectation, lingered in the air. There was, Whimsy knew, still a piece of the puzzle obscured beneath layers of half-truth and deliberate omission. After a moment's pause, he turned to Langley with an arch smile that betrayed nothing but amused curiosity. "Mr. Langley, you appear remarkably calm given these accusations of willful blindness. Yet your proximity to the deceased and to Mr. Edgeworth's machinations seems, shall we say, less than coincidental." Langley shifted uneasily, clearing his throat. "I assure you, Lord Peter, my duties were strictly professional. I had no knowledge of Mr. Edgeworth's visitations or the widow's private dealings beyond what was formally disclosed to me. But you were present at the luncheon the day prior, Mr. Langley, and you, if memory serves, received a rather urgent note that afternoon, one conveniently mislaid from our initial inquiries," Whimsy countered smoothly, his gaze piercing. Langley's facade faltered for an instant, a flicker of color betraying his composure. "That note was personal, irrelevant to the case at hand." "Ah, but in mysteries, Irrelevant is often the coin of deception, Whimsy remarked, his voice a caustic murmur. Might we inspect this note? Langley hesitated, then with a grudging nod produced a folded scrap of paper from his waistcoat pocket. The handwriting was hurried but legible, a terse message from an unknown sender, warning Langley to cease inquiries and leave the matter to those who understand. No signature. Whimsy's fingers traced the lines thoughtfully. Warning indeed, directed at the solicitor, of all persons. This suggests someone felt sufficiently threatened to curb your involvement. It is quite telling. Mrs. Prendergast's eyes darted between Langley and Whimsy, her knuckles whitening as she clutched her apron. "There's more to this than you all realize," she whispered, voice trembling. Mr. Edgeworth was not the only one pressing the widow. There were others, silent, unseen, but no less dangerous. "Others?" Whimsy prompted, arching an eyebrow. "Aye," she nodded, swallowing hard. "Figures in the village who'd lose much if certain secrets came to light. Old debts, hidden affairs, even matters touching on the church itself. The widow knew things some would kill to keep buried." A chill crept through the room. Whimsy recognized the classic implication. A network of interests intertwined by social standing, reputation, and quiet blackmail. The very fabric of this seemingly genteel community was frayed by the widow's knowledge. Whimsy's thoughts sharpened. The widow's secret past, the cryptic diary entries, the threatening letters all pointed to a multi-layered intrigue, not merely a matter of one man's vengeance. He recalled the earlier interview with the vicar, whose nervous evasions hinted at a protective silence. Could he, too, be complicit or at least a reluctant keeper of these secrets? It was time to probe deeper into the village itself. He resolved to visit the parish church and the local inn, venues where whispered alliances and grudges often took root beneath the guise of everyday camaraderie. At the church, the vicar met him with practiced cordiality, though his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he adjusted his clerical collar. Whimsy's approach was gentle but unyielding, delicately peeling back layers of ecclesiastical propriety. The vicar admitted the widow's attendance had been irregular of late, her demeanor shadowed by something more than grief. "She confided in me, in moments of weakness," he said, "about a past she wished to atone for, though she never fully revealed its nature." "Did she ever speak of threats to her safety, or of blackmailers among her parishioners?" Whimsy inquired, voice carefully neutral. "Only vague references," the vicar replied, avoiding the question. "Some sins, Lord Peter, are better left buried, lest they poison the living." This evasion confirmed Whimsy's suspicions. The church held a secret its pastor was loath to expose. Next, at the inn, the local landlord, a stout man with a florid face and a penchant for gossip, was less reserved. Between sips of dark ale, he recounted the arrival of a stranger matching Edgeworth's description and hinted at other late-night visitors known to converse with the widow in hushed tones. Heard tell she was tangled up in something nasty old debts, blackmail, and a scandal that could topple more than just a few reputations. The landlord confided, lowering his voice. "People don't like to speak of it openly, but there's talk of letters, of documents that would ruin many respectable folk." Whimsy smiled thinly. The plot thickened like treacle. He realized the widow had been a linchpin in a secret network of leverage and intimidation, a veritable spider's web spun beneath the genteel surface. Returning to the manor, Whimsy contemplated the chronology once more. The widow's final hours were marked not only by Edgeworth's threatening visits, but also by the unseen pressure of this shadowy collective. The halted clock, the missing salver, and the staged teacup were all parts of a complex tableau designed to conceal not merely a murder, but a massacre of reputation. He shared his insights with Bunter, who had been quietly cataloging the household's comings and goings. Together, they scrutinized the timeline of visitors, deliveries, and correspondence, isolating anomalies that previously seemed trivial. It was then that Whimsy noted an incongruity. A gap in the household. S reported activities during the widow's last afternoon. A window during which neither the servants nor the family could account for their movements. A window that corresponded with the time the poison must have been administered. This gap was not accidental. It was the heart of the deception. Whimsy's next step was clear. He would revisit the servants' quarters and question those who might have concealed the truth, whether out of fear, loyalty, or complicity. In these interviews, the atmosphere shifted. Reticence gave way to nervousness. Casual denials faltered under his unerring gaze. Patterns emerged: small details, a delayed meal, a misplaced key, the subtle scent of a rare perfume at an unusual hour. One young maid, flushed and stammering, admitted to having seen Mrs. Prendergast in the pantry shortly before the poisoning. Another confessed to overhearing a whispered conversation between Mrs. Prendergast and a visitor, whose voice she did not recognize. Whimsy's suspicions about the housekeeper deepened. Was she the true architect of the widow's fate, acting either under duress or with a darker motive? But what motive? Jealousy, greed, or a misguided attempt to protect the household's fragile peace? Whimsy resolved to confront Mrs. Prendergast. Once more, armed with these new revelations, he found her in the kitchen, her posture rigid, eyes sharp yet guarded. He approached with the measured courtesy that could disarm or dominate in equal measure. "Mrs. Prendergast," he began, "I am compelled to ask again about your relationship with Mr. Edgeworth and your involvement in the events leading to the widow's death." Her face paled, but her voice was steady. "Lord Peter, I did what I thought best to protect the household. Mr. Edgeworth was a danger not just to the widow but to us all. I sought to contain his influence." "And the poison?" A long silence. "I did not administer it," she finally said, eyes glistening. "But I knew it was coming. I found the vial, hidden among the widow's possessions. I feared for her, but I was powerless to stop it." Whimsy studied her closely. Was this confession born of guilt or manipulation? Her earlier cooperation suggested sincerity, yet her reticence hinted at withheld truths. Who, then, possessed both the opportunity and the intent to execute this cruel deed? He pressed. She looked away, voice dropping to a whisper. Someone desperate. Someone who feared the widow's revelations would destroy them all. Whimsy's mind raced. The final actor in this tragic drama remained elusive, concealed behind layers of fear and allegiance. As the morning sun broke fully over Folly Manor, its light unmasking the intricate shadows within, Whimsy realized that the final act was near. The stage was set for the unraveling of the last secret, the exposure of the killer who had so carefully crafted a tableau of deception. The widow's teacup had been full, but so was the house with secrets, and soon every one of them would spill forth. The morning light streaming through the high mullioned windows of Folly Manor illuminated the faint dust motes hanging in the air like tiny specters, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Lord Peter Whimsy sat in the widow's once vibrant drawing room, now drained of warmth and vitality, the very atmosphere pregnant with the memory of that fatal afternoon. The teacup, its contents long vanished, still sat on the silver tray, an eerie symbol of the fragile veneer of civility shattered beneath it. Whimsy's mind was meticulously engaged, assembling the threads of the narrative with the deliberate care of a master weaver. The shadowy network of secrets, the whispered threats, the timing inconsistencies, and above all, the human frailty that motivated this tragedy, all converged into a tapestry as intricate as it was macabre. The final piece, he was certain, was to be found in the interplay between the household's delicate social hierarchy and the subtle manipulations of those who had appeared most benign. Langley's earlier nervy comportment, Mrs. Prendergast's confessions tinged with reluctance, and the vicar's evasions had laid bare a common theme. Each individual, in their own way, was ensnared by the widow's knowledge, some out of fear, others out of loyalty or self-preservation. Yet none seemed to grasp the lethal inevitability that had arisen. Whimsy rose from his chair, his gait purposeful as he headed toward the servants' quarters once again, this time to re-examine the physical evidence rather than the narratives. The pantry, the scene of Mrs. Prendergast's confession regarding the hidden vial, now beckoned with a new significance. The narrow wooden shelves, lined with tins and bottles, bore no outward sign of disturbance, yet Whimsy's practiced eye noted a faint residue, a subtle scent of almonds, faint but unmistakable, lingering near the back corner, cyanide. Choice of poison was deliberate, a method as quick as it was merciless. He carefully fingered the edge of a crate, then crouched, eyes narrowing on a slight scuff on the floorboards beneath. It was almost imperceptible, but betrayed a recent movement, perhaps the removal of an object or the hiding of evidence. From this vantage, the timeline resumed a sharper definition. The poison must have been introduced shortly before the widow's. Tea was served, most likely during the brief period when the household reported no activity, the mysterious gap in the afternoon's chronology. The servants' nervous evasions had hinted at this window, but now the physical trace corroborated the suspicion. Returning upstairs, Whimsy sought out Bunter, whose detailed notes he knew would be indispensable. Together, they cross-referenced the times, noting especially the arrival and departure of visitors, the shifting locations of staff members, and the household's domestic rhythms. A curious detail emerged: the cook, who had been notably absent during the late afternoon, claimed to have been in the garden, a plausible enough alibi. Except the gardener reported seeing no one outside during that time. This discrepancy piqued Whimsy's attention. He requested a private word with the cook, Mrs. Withers, a stout woman with keen eyes and a sharp tongue concealed beneath a veil of geniality. Double quotes, Mrs. Withers. Whimsy began smoothly. Your absence at such a critical moment is noted with interest. Might you care to clarify your whereabouts? Mrs. Withers blinked, then composed herself. I was indeed in the garden, my lord, tending to the rosebush, as the weather was so pleasant. Yet the gardener insists otherwise. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Perhaps the gardener was distracted, my lord. It was but a brief interval. Whimsy allowed a smile, half teasing, half predatory. Brief intervals are often the cruelest, Mrs. Withers. The cook's momentary hesitation was telling. Pressed gently, she admitted to entering the pantry that afternoon, ostensibly to retrieve preserves, but in reality, to speak with Mrs. Prendergast. The content of their conversation was shrouded in secrecy, but the cook hinted at a plan and intention to protect the household at all costs. This confirmation deepened the complexity of the narrative. There was a silent cabal within the manor, perhaps acting in concert or at cross purposes, to conceal or control the widow's revelations. Whimsy's mind circled back to Mrs. Prendergast. If she had indeed discovered the vial and feared for the widow's safety, did she attempt to intervene? Or was her role more complicit than she had confessed? The solution lay in a small, overlooked detail: the widow's teacup. The silver tray upon which it rested bore faint but telling fingerprints, some smudged, others distinctly sharp. Whimsy studied the imprints, the angles of the finger marks revealing the sequence of handling. He deduced that the cup had been deliberately placed with its handle away from the widow, forcing her to grasp it awkwardly, a subtle but calculated move to ensure the poison was ingested without suspicion. Who had arranged this? Returning to Mrs. Prendergast's statement about the silent danger, Whimsy formulated a hypothesis. The housekeeper's protective instincts may have been sincere, but perhaps misguided. She feared a direct confrontation with the true culprit, someone who wielded power beyond her reach. The logical suspect, therefore, was not one of the obvious villains, but someone occupying a position of quiet authority within the manor. Whimsy resolved to test this theory with a carefully staged reenactment of the widow's final afternoon. He gathered the household in the drawing room, his tone formal yet tinged with the customary irony that masked his piercing intellect. Let us, if you will indulge me, recreate the sequence of events leading to the widow's final tea. He proposed, eyes scanning each face in turn. Servants and family exchanged glances, some apprehensive, others defensive. Whimsy instructed Mrs. Prendergast to fetch the silver tray and teacup, and for Langley to recount once more his movements during the critical hours as the scene unfolded. Under Whimsy's direction, discrepancies in testimonies and actions surfaced naturally. A misplaced step here, a forgotten glance there, the pattern grew clearer. It was during this exercise that the gardener, previously unremarked upon, inadvertently revealed a critical fact. He mentioned seeing Langley near the pantry at an unusual hour, a statement that contradicted Langley's claims of having remained in the study. The room tightened with tension. Whimsy seized the moment. Mr. Langley, care to explain this apparent contradiction? Langley's composure cracked like fragile glass. I went to speak with Mrs. Prendergast. There was talk of a letter that concerned the widow's estate. Ah, Whimsy said softly, letters again. And might that letter have contained something worth silencing? Langley's gaze fell. Whimsy pressed. Your note warned you off the case. Someone wished your silence. Did you comply, or did your curiosity lead you further into peril? The truth unraveled swiftly after that. Langley confessed to discovering documents that implicated more than one household member in attempts to manipulate the widow's will using threats and blackmail. He had confronted Mrs. Prendergast, who had warned him to desist. The poison, then, was the ultimate measure taken by those desperate to preserve their fragile dominion. The housekeeper, though complicit in concealment, was not the murderer but a frightened guardian. The true culprit was a figure who had balanced social standing, opportunity, and motive with cold precision. Langley, in his desperation, had stumbled too close to the truth. Whimsy, with his trademark wry smile, summed up the case before the assembled household. The widow's teacup was indeed full, but so too was the cup of human folly, ambition, and fear. Each played their part in this grim mask. Yet in the end, it is the quietest hand that delivers the sharpest blow. As the culprit's mask fell away under the weight of incontrovertible logic, the household shuddered, not merely at the revelation, but at the uncomfortable truth of their own complicity in the tragedy. Whimsy lit a cigar, the smoke curling upward. As he cast a final glance around the room, justice, like tea, is best served with a clear mind and a steady hand. May we all learn to savor it with less bitterness. With that, he turned and departed into the burgeoning daylight, leaving behind a house forever altered, its secrets spilled, its masks removed, its silence shattered. The widow's teacup, though empty, had poured forth a story as sharp and precise as the poison it once held. The assembled company in the drawing-room grew noticeably quieter as Lord Peter Whimsy took his accustomed place near the hearth, his demeanor both regal and amused, as if presiding over a theatrical performance he alone fully understood. His sharp eyes flicked once more over the familiar faces, some resolute, some crestfallen, all awaiting the moment when the tangled skein would finally be unraveled. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice deliberately measured, we have traversed an intricate path of half-truths, evasions, and carefully concealed motives. What remains is to illuminate the final act, the precise mechanism by which a single cup of tea became an instrument of death. He gestured towards the silver tray, now polished, and returned to its place on the side table, and then to the widow's chair, where the empty teacup had rested. The poison was cyanide, as you all know. Its presence was subtle but fatal, introduced during the brief period when the household's routine fractured, the so-called silent hour, the critical question, who had both the means and opportunity to administer it. Whimsy's gaze settled on Mr. Langley, whose earlier confession had loosened the threads, but not yet completed the tapestry. Mr. Langley, your discovery of the incriminating letters and your confrontation with Mrs. Prendergast were indeed courageous but not without consequence. Yet I suspect you were but a pawn in a game played by a far more calculating mind." Turning then to Mrs. Prendergast, Whimsy's tone softened slightly. "You acted out of loyalty and fear, protecting the household and perhaps your own fragile position. It is understandable, though misguided." All eyes shifted uneasily, the weight of collective complicity pressing down. "But the true architect," Whimsy continued, "is one whose station affords discretion and whose character masks a ruthless pragmatism. The person whose presence during the widow's final hour was most telling, not in what was said, but what was withheld." He paused, allowing tension to thicken the room's heavy air. Double quotes, "Mrs. Withers, the cook, your insistence on a garden alibi was contradicted by the gardener's witness. You were near the pantry when the vial was removed. Why?" The cook's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "Because," Whimsy said quietly, "you feared exposure of a secret bargain. You knew that silence could be purchased and death delivered with equal precision." The room gasped as the accusation hung like a guillotine's blade. Whimsy elaborated. "It was you who arranged the widow's teacup so that the handle was inconvenient, forcing her to drink without suspicion. You administered the poison, believing it would save the household from ruin and yourself from disgrace." Mrs. Withers' defiant facade cracked. She dropped her gaze and whispered, "I did what I must. She threatened to undo us all." "Indeed," Whimsy replied, "but justice must remain as impartial as the poison was indiscriminate." He turned back to the assembled company. "Let this be a sober reminder that beneath the genteel exterior of Fawley Manor lay not just secrets, but a web of fears and ambitions, each thread taut with human frailty." Lighting a cigarette with his habitual flourish, Whimsy added, "In truth, it is the subtleties, the quiet manipulations, and the overlooked contradictions that betray the murderer." The widow's teacup was full, not merely of tea, but of human weakness and folly. With a final glance, heavy with irony and a faint smile playing about his lips, Lord Peter Whimsy stepped towards the door. "May we all take care to keep our cups a little less full and our minds a little clearer." And with that, he departed, leaving behind a household shaken but cleansed by truth, the shadows that had once cloaked Fawley Manor receding into the indifferent light of day.